stood before the ancient mirror in the private chambers of Kensington Palace, her reflection fragmented by centuries of royal gazes. The weight of history pressed against her shoulders as surely as the delicate tiara that would soon grace her head. Tonight was different. Tonight, she would wear the halo tiara for the last time before it was passed to the next generation, and with it, she would carry forward stories that had never been told. The tiara lay before her on a velvet cushion, its 739 brilliant-cut diamonds and 149 baguette diamonds catching the soft light of the dressing room. Each stone seemed to hold a memory, a whisper from the past that only she could hear. As her lady-in-waiting approached with careful hands, closed her eyes, and let herself drift back to the beginning of her journey with these precious crowns that had shaped not just her appearance, but her very soul. She remembered the first time she had seen this very tiara, not on her own head, but in a faded photograph tucked away in a leather-bound album that Prince William had shown her during their courtship. His grandmother, the Queen Mother, smiled from the sepia image, wearing the same diamonds that would later become his wedding crown. The young woman in the photograph looked radiant, hopeful, unaware of the decades of duty and sacrifice that lay ahead. "It was my great-grandmother's favorite," William had said that day, his fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. "She always said it made her feel like herself, not just a princess." Those words had stayed with through every fitting, every state dinner, every moment when the weight of the crown felt too heavy to bear. The halo tiara had been purchased by King George VI in 1936, originally intended as a gift for his wife, Queen Elizabeth, who would later become the beloved Queen Mother. But the story had discovered went deeper than any official record could capture. Through hushed conversations with elderly palace staff and handwritten letters found in forgotten drawers, she had learned that this tiara represented something profound. It was a symbol of love persisting through the darkest of times. The Queen Mother had worn it on the night before the coronation of her husband, when the weight of unexpected kingship threatened to crush their family. She had stood, much as stood now, looking at her reflection and wondering if she was strong enough for what lay ahead. The tiara had given her courage then, and now it passed that same strength too. As the diamonds settled against her temples, felt the familiar transformation begin. She was no longer simply Kate from Berkshire, the girl who had dreamed of ordinary things like teaching children and living quietly in the countryside. She was the Princess of Wales, keeper of traditions that stretched back centuries, guardian of stories that the world desperately needed to hear. The first public event where she had worn the halo had been her wedding day in 2011. The whole world watched as she walked down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, but what they couldn't see was the conversation she had with the tiara the night before. Alone in her room at the Goring Hotel, she had held the precious crown in her hands and made a promise, not just to William, not just to the crown, but to every woman who had worn these diamonds before her. "I promise to honor your stories," she had whispered to the silent jewels. "I promise to remember that these aren't just pretty things, but symbols of the women who came before me, who faced their fears and found their courage." The wedding day itself had been a blur of cameras and crowds, but remembered the moment when the tiara had almost slipped during the carriage ride back to Palace. William had reached over discreetly to steady it, and in that gesture she had seen a glimpse of their future, him always there to support her when the weight became too much, and her learning to balance the crown with grace and dignity. But it was the months that followed the wedding that truly taught what it meant to wear these royal jewels. Each tiara came with its own personality, its own demands, its own lessons. The lotus flower tiara, which she would later fall in love with, taught her about resilience, how something beautiful could emerge from the muddiest waters. The lover's knot tiara, with its tragic connection to Diana, taught her about legacy and the responsibility of honoring those who came before while forging her own path. Yet it was always the halo that felt most like home. Perhaps because it had been her first, or perhaps because it carried the gentlest energy of all the crowns in the royal collection. The Queen Mother's spirit seemed to linger in its delicate framework, offering guidance during the most challenging moments of royal life. Recalled the evening when she had first worn the tiara to a state banquet, just 6 months after her wedding. She had been terrified, surrounded by world leaders and dignitaries who seemed to speak in codes she didn't understand. The tiara had felt heavy that night, almost accusatory, as if it was questioning whether she truly belonged in such elevated company. But then she had caught sight of an elderly ambassador's wife, sitting alone at the far end of the table, looking overwhelmed and out of place. Something in the woman's expression reminded of her own feelings, and without thinking, she had excused herself from conversation with a foreign minister and made her way over to offer comfort and companionship. Later that evening, the queen had pulled aside. "That was beautifully done, my dear," she had said, her eyes twinkling with approval. "The crown you wear is not meant to separate you from people, but to remind you of your duty to serve them. Tonight, you understood that perfectly." From that moment forward, began to see her tiaras not as burdens, but as tools of connection. Each time she wore the halo, she thought of the Queen Mother's own journey from shy duchess to beloved queen. She thought of the state dinners during World War II, when this very tiara had sparkled under the dim lights of Palace, while bombs fell on London. She imagined the Queen Mother wearing it to boost morale, to show the British people that their royal family would not be broken by adversity. The tiara had witnessed moments of incredible joy and profound sorrow. It had been present at and funerals, at celebrations of victory and moments of national mourning. Each diamond seemed to carry the echoes of these events, and often felt that wearing it was like carrying forward the collective memory of her adopted nation. There were nights when she would sit in her private study, the tiara resting on its stand nearby, and she would write in her journal about the weight of representation. How do you honor the past while building the future? How do you remain authentic while fulfilling the expectations of an institution that predates your great-grandparents? The answers often came not from books or advisors, but from the silent wisdom of the jewels themselves. The halo had taught her that strength didn't always look like steel and resolve. Sometimes it looked like vulnerability, like the courage to admit when you didn't know something, like the wisdom to ask for help when the crown became too heavy. The Queen Mother had been beloved not because she was perfect, but because she was genuinely human while fulfilling an inhuman role. As prepared for another evening of royal duties, she reflected on how much the tiara had changed her, and how much she had perhaps changed it in return. The diamonds that had once felt cold and distant now seemed warm with shared experiences. She had worn this crown through her first solo engagement, her first speech to Parliament, her first Christmas broadcast to the Commonwealth. Each occasion had added layers to her relationship with the precious jewels. She remembered the Christmas when little George had reached up to touch the sparkling diamonds while she was getting ready for church, his small fingers fascinated by how they caught and reflected the light. In that moment, she had realized that these tiaras would someday be part of his story too, part of the legacy she was helping to shape for future generations. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. What kind of world would her children inherit? What stories would these diamonds carry forward when she was gone? Would future princesses look at photographs of her wearing this tiara and wonder what she had been thinking, what fears and dreams had occupied her mind during these glittering moments? Tonight's event would be particularly significant. It was the first state dinner since the Queen's passing, and would be wearing the halo as a tribute to both the Queen and the Queen Mother, the two women who had most shaped her understanding of what it meant to serve while wearing a crown. The weight of that responsibility felt especially heavy tonight, but as she looked at herself in the mirror, saw not just her own reflection, but the faces of all the women who had worn this tiara before her. They seemed to nod in encouragement, their spirits woven into the very fabric of the diamonds that crowned her head. She was not alone in this role, never had been alone. She was part of a sisterhood that transcended time, united by their commitment to duty, their dedication to service, and their shared understanding of the transformative power of wearing the crown. As the final adjustments were made to her gown, and the tiara was secured with the expertise born of decades of practice, took one last look in the mirror. Tomorrow, she would remove the halo and carefully place it back in its velvet case. But tonight, it would help her tell the story of resilience, of grace under pressure, of the quiet strength that had carried the monarchy through its darkest hours and into a new era of hope. The diamonds sparkled as she moved toward the door, each facet catching the light and throwing it back in brilliant displays of color and fire. But no longer saw just the surface beauty of the jewels. She saw the depth of their history, the weight of their significance, and the promise they held for the future. She was ready to add her own chapter to their story, to wear the crown not as a burden, but as a bridge between the past and the future, between tradition and progress, between the woman she had been and the queen she was becoming. The morning after the state dinner woke to find herself changed in ways she couldn't immediately name. The halo had been carefully returned to its secure home within the Tower of London's collection, but its influence lingered like perfume in the air around her. She had crossed some invisible threshold the night before, and now she felt ready to explore the deeper mysteries hidden within the royal tiara collection. It was during her private breakfast with William that she first mentioned her growing fascination with the stories behind each crown. "They're not just jewelry," she said, setting down her teacup with unusual intensity. "Each one carries the soul of the woman who wore it most. I can feel them communicating with me." William looked up from his newspaper, initially prepared to offer a gentle smile at what he might have dismissed as fanciful thinking from anyone else. But something in Six's expression stopped him. Her eyes held a depth of understanding that he recognized the same look his grandmother had worn when she spoke of the crown jewels, as if she could see connections invisible to others. "Tell me about the lotus flower tiara," continued, her voice soft but determined. "I know the official history, but I want to know about the woman who made it sing." The lotus flower tiara had always been one of the most mysterious pieces in the collection. Created in the 1920s, its Art Deco design featured diamonds arranged in a pattern that resembled lotus blossoms rising from stylized leaves. The official records were frustratingly sparse. It had been commissioned by an unknown benefactor and had somehow made its way into the royal collection through a series of private sales and discreet acquisitions. What the records didn't reveal was the story that had begun to piece together through months of careful research and whispered conversations with the palace's oldest staff members. The tiara had originally belonged to Lady, a woman whose life had been touched by both extraordinary privilege and devastating loss. Had been one of the bright young things of the 1920s, beautiful and vivacious, engaged to marry a duke's heir who seemed destined for greatness. But the Spanish flu pandemic had torn through Europe with ruthless efficiency and had watched helplessly as her succumbed to the disease just weeks before their planned wedding. Rather than retreat into mourning as society expected, had thrown herself into humanitarian work, using her considerable wealth to help families devastated by the pandemic. She had commissioned the lotus flower tiara as a symbol of her personal philosophy, that beauty and purpose could rise from even the muddiest, most difficult circumstances. Had discovered S's diary in the archives of a charity that the young woman had founded, and the entries revealed a soul of extraordinary depth and resilience. "Today I wore my lotus crown to the opening of the Children's Hospital," had written in 1925. "The diamonds caught the light streaming through the windows, and for a moment I felt Frederick's presence beside me. He would have loved to see what we've built from the ashes of our dreams." The tiara had remained in S's family until 1952, when her nephew, facing enormous death duties, had quietly sold it to an intermediary who eventually offered it to the royal collection. By then, herself had passed away, but her legacy lived on in the institutions she had built and the lives she had touched. When first tried on the lotus flower tiara for a private viewing, she immediately understood why it had called to her. The weight distribution was perfect, but more than that, the crown seemed to radiate a sense of purposeful beauty that matched her own evolving understanding of royal duty. She had worn it for the first time in public during a gala for a children's mental health charity, and the choice had been deeply intentional. As she moved through the crowd that evening, speaking with young people who had overcome tremendous challenges, felt spirit guiding her conversations, lending her the right words to offer comfort and inspiration. "Your Royal Highness," a teenage girl had whispered during the receiving line, "you make that crown look like it belongs to you," had smiled and leaned closer to respond, "I think perhaps it's the crown that's making me belong to it." That night marked the beginning of deeper relationship with the royal jewelry collection. She began to see each piece not as an accessory to be worn for its beauty, but as a tool for connection, a bridge between her private self and her public role. The lotus flower tiara became her favorite for events focused on resilience and recovery. She wore it to hospital openings, to galas supporting mental health initiatives, to ceremonies honoring everyday heroes who had overcome adversity. Each time, she felt S's presence lending strength to her words and purpose to her actions. But it was during a particularly challenging period in her own life that truly understood the transformative power of wearing S's crown. The press had been especially critical following a minor protocol error at a diplomatic reception, and found herself questioning whether she would ever truly master the impossible balance between being herself and fulfilling her royal role. She had retreated to her private study that evening, still wearing the lotus flower tiara from the children's charity event she had attended earlier. As she sat in the gathering darkness, too drained to turn on the lights, the diamonds continued to catch and reflect the last rays of sunlight filtering through the windows. In that moment of quiet desperation, felt a presence in the room that she couldn't rationally explain. It was as if it stepped through time to sit beside her, offering the wisdom that could only come from someone who had faced her own moments of profound doubt and emerged stronger. "The lotus grows most beautiful in the darkest water," whispered to herself, remembering a line from S diary. "And the crown finds its true purpose not in perfect moments, but in the times when wearing it requires the most courage." From that evening forward, his relationship with all the royal tiaras deepened beyond mere aesthetic appreciation. She began to research each piece not just for its gemological significance, but for the human stories embedded in their creation and history. The rose tiara, which had belonged to the Queen Mother's family, taught her about the importance of never forgetting one's roots. The delicate rose design, created in the early 20th century, represented the Scottish heritage that the Queen Mother had carried with her throughout her royal life. When wore it to events in Scotland, she felt connected not just to the land, but to the idea that authenticity and duty could coexist. Each tiara seemed to choose its own moments to be worn, matching itself to the energy and purpose of specific events. The papyrus tiara, with its Egyptian-inspired motifs, felt right for cultural exchanges and diplomatic receptions with Middle Eastern dignitaries. The delicate pieces seemed to prefer intimate gatherings where personal connection mattered more than grand display. But it was the stories behind the stones themselves that truly captured imagination. She learned that many of the diamonds in the royal collection had been gifts from the far reaches of the empire, each one carrying the hopes and loyalties of people who had never seen the palaces where their treasures would eventually reside. Some stones had been reset multiple times, their beauty adapted to changing fashions while their essential character remained constant. Began to see parallels between these transformed jewels and her own evolution as a royal. Like the diamonds, she was being cut and polished by experience, her rough edges refined while her core self remained unchanged. The process of selecting which tiara to wear for each occasion became a form of meditation for her. She would study her calendar, considering not just the formality of each event, but its emotional undertone, its historical significance, its potential for meaningful connection with others. When she chose the lotus flower tiara for a visit to a women's shelter, she knew she was channeling S legacy of turning personal pain into purposeful action. When she selected the rose for a Highland Games celebration, she was honoring the Queen Mother's gift for making everyone feel valued and welcomed. The tiaras had begun to feel like trusted advisors, each offering their own perspective on the complexities of royal life. Through them, felt connected to a sisterhood that spanned generations, women who had faced similar challenges, made similar sacrifices, and found their own ways to serve with grace and dignity. But perhaps the most profound lesson the tiaras taught her was about the nature of transformation itself. Just as the raw diamonds had been shaped by intense pressure and heat to achieve their brilliant fire, was learning that the most beautiful aspects of royal service emerged from the most challenging moments. She began to approach difficult events with a different mindset, asking not, "How can I get through this?" but "What can this experience teach me about serving others with greater compassion and understanding?" The tiaras, with their accumulated wisdom of decades of royal service, seemed to whisper encouragement during these moments of growth. As prepared for bed that evening, carefully removing her jewelry and placing each piece in its designated safe, she reflected on how much her understanding of royal duty had evolved since her wedding day. The crowns that had once felt like beautiful but intimidating obligations now felt like trusted companions on a journey of continuous learning and service. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, new moments where the weight of the crown would test her resolve. But no longer feared these tests. She had learned that true royal bearing came not from perfect performance, but from authentic dedication to something larger than oneself. The lotus flower tiara sat in its case, diamonds dark in the evening light, but could still feel its presence like a warm embrace. Its legacy lived on, not just in the beautiful crown she had commissioned, but in every act of compassion it inspired, every moment of courage it strengthened, every life it helped to transform through the power of purposeful beauty. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, its heavy cream paper bearing the unmistakable elegance of royal correspondence. Read it twice before the full significance settled in her mind. The Crown Estate was requesting her presence at a private viewing of several tiaras that had recently been discovered in a forgotten vault beneath Windsor Castle. pieces that hadn't seen daylight for more than 60 years. Among the artifacts was the legendary Spencer Tiara, though not the one made famous by Diana. This was an earlier creation, commissioned in the 1890s by the 7th Earl Spencer for his daughter's coming-of-age celebration. The family records had been lost in a fire decades earlier, and the tiara had been presumed destroyed until construction work at Windsor had revealed a hidden chamber filled with carefully preserved royal treasures. As made her way to the private viewing room deep within Windsor's ancient walls, she felt a familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with reverence. Each encounter with a new piece from the royal collection had taught her something profound about the women who had worn these crowns before her, and she sensed that today would be particularly significant. The Spencer tiara lay on a velvet cushion under soft lighting, its design more delicate than its famous successor, but no less breathtaking. The diamonds were arranged in a pattern of stylized flowers and leaves, each element flowing into the next with organic grace. But what struck most immediately was the sense of youth and possibility that seemed to emanate from the piece, as if it still held echoes of the young woman's dreams for whom it had been created. Lady Charlotte Spencer, the curator explained, consulting his notes. She would have been 18 when this was made for her. From what we can piece together from surviving correspondence, she was considered one of the great beauties of her generation, but also remarkably intelligent. Quite unusual for a young woman of that era to be educated alongside her brothers, but the 7th Earl believed strongly in preparing all his children for meaningful lives. Found herself drawn to a small exhibition case nearby, where several personal items discovered alongside the tiara had been displayed. A leather-bound journal caught her eye, its pages yellow with age but still legible. The curator, nodding her interest, carefully opened it to reveal Charlotte Spencer's distinctive handwriting. "Today Papa presented me with the most exquisite crown," read aloud, her voice soft with wonder. "He says it represents not just my entry into society, but my responsibility to use whatever advantages I possess in service of others. I tried it on before the mirror in Mama's room, and I felt transformed not into someone different, but into the truest version of myself." The words resonated deeply with, who remembered her own moment of transformation when she first wore the halo on her wedding day. But Charlotte's story, she soon discovered, took a dramatically different turn than her own. Through patient research over the following weeks, pieced together the remarkable life of Lady Charlotte Spencer. Rather than following the expected path of marriage to suitable nobility, Charlotte had shocked society by dedicating her life to education reform and women's rights. She had used her family's influence and her own considerable intellect to establish schools for working-class girls throughout England, always insisting that education was the most powerful tool for transforming lives. The tiara had been her constant companion through these endeavors. Photographs from the period showed Charlotte wearing it at fundraising galas, political gatherings, and even at the opening ceremonies of her schools. In each image, the crown seemed to amplify not just her natural beauty, but her fierce determination to create meaningful change in the world. What made Charlotte's story particularly poignant was its tragic ending. She had never married, having chosen her mission over personal romance, and when she died in 1924 at the age of 52, she had no direct heirs to inherit her legacy. Her beloved tiara and other personal effects had been quietly added to the royal collection, where they had waited in darkness for nearly a century to tell their story once again. Felt a profound connection to Charlotte's vision of using privilege for purpose. When she finally had the opportunity to wear the Spencer tiara for the first time, at a gala supporting educational initiatives for disadvantaged youth, she felt Charlotte's presence as strongly as if the Victorian reformer had been standing beside her. The evening proved to be one of the most meaningful of her royal career. Speaking to a room filled with educators, philanthropists, and young people who had overcome significant obstacles to achieve academic success, she felt the tiara lending weight to her words and authority to her message. "Education has always been the great equalizer," told the assembled crowd, and as she spoke, she felt Charlotte Spencer nodding in approval from across the decades. "It doesn't matter where you come from or what circumstances you face, knowledge is the one treasure that can never be taken from you, and it grows more valuable the more generously you share it." But it was during a private moment later that evening that experienced the most profound connection to Charlotte's legacy. A young woman approached her during the reception, tears in her eyes as she explained how the scholarship program championed had allowed her to become the first in her family to attend university. "I want to be a teacher," the girl said simply. "I want to go back to my community and help other kids like me believe that education can change everything." Felt the Spencer tiara suddenly grow warm against her temples, as if Charlotte's spirit was celebrating this moment of her mission continuing through new generations. The crown had found its purpose once again, connecting past dreams to present possibilities. This experience with Charlotte Spencer's tiara opened eyes to the broader ecosystem of stories within the royal jewelry collection. She began to understand that each piece represented not just the woman who had worn it, but the countless lives that woman had touched, the causes she had championed, the changes she had helped to create in the world. The pearl drop tiara, which had belonged to Queen Mary's grandmother, carried stories of diplomatic triumph and international peace negotiations. The delicate pearls had witnessed conversations that helped prevent conflicts and forge alliances that lasted for generations. When wore it to diplomatic receptions, she felt the weight of that legacy encouraging her to seek common ground and build bridges between different perspectives. The aquamarine tiara, with its ethereal blue stones reminiscent of ocean waves, had been favored by Princess Marina of Greece, who had brought a sense of international glamour to the British royal family in the 1930s. Marina had used her multilingual abilities and cosmopolitan background to strengthen Britain's relationships with European allies during increasingly turbulent times. Discovered that Marina had often worn the aquamarine stones to events where cultural exchange was the primary goal. The princess had believed deeply in the power of art, music, and literature to transcend political boundaries, and she had used royal patronage to support artists and writers who might otherwise have been silenced by rising authoritarianism. When wore the aquamarine tiara to a celebration of Commonwealth arts, she felt Marina's passion for creative expression flowing through her interactions with the assembled artists, writers, and performers. The tiara seemed to enhance her ability to connect with people from vastly different backgrounds, finding common threads in their shared dedication to beauty and truth. Each tiara, realized, was like a tuning fork that resonated with specific frequencies of purpose and meaning. The geometric patterns of the Art Deco pieces connected her to an era of innovation and social change, when women were redefining their roles and pushing boundaries in every field. The more traditional Victorian designs reminded her of the importance of honoring established wisdom while working for gradual, sustainable progress. The discovery of Charlotte Spencer's tiara had also inspired to look more deeply into the stories of women whose contributions had been overshadowed by more famous figures. She learned about Lady Campbell, whose tiara had been melted down during World War II to support the war effort, but whose legacy lived on in the veterans' support network she had established. She read about Princess Helena Victoria, whose modest coronet had accompanied her on countless visits to hospitals and orphanages, where her gentle presence had brought comfort to thousands of suffering children. These women had understood something that was now learning herself, that the true power of wearing a crown came not from the status it conveyed, but from the responsibility it represented. Each diamond had been formed under intense pressure deep within the earth, and each tiara had been forged through the intense pressure of serving others with grace, dignity, and unwavering commitment. As prepared for sleep that evening, carefully removing Charlotte Spencer's tiara and placing it in its protective case, she reflected on how profoundly her understanding of royal duty had evolved since her wedding day. She was no longer simply wearing beautiful jewelry to formal events. She was carrying forward the accumulated wisdom and dedication of generations of women who had used their positions to make the world a little brighter, a little more just, a little more hopeful. The Spencer tiara caught the lamplight one final time before the case closed, and could swear she saw Charlotte Spencer's determined spirit flickering in the depths of the diamonds. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve, new chances to honor the legacy of purposeful beauty that these crowns represented. The weight of responsibility no longer felt burdensome too. It felt like a gift, an invitation to join a sisterhood of women who had understood that true nobility came not from birth or title, but from the courage to use whatever advantages life provided in service of something larger than oneself. The tiaras were her teachers, her guides, and her companions on a journey that grew more meaningful with each passing day. The call came at dawn, urgent and unexpected. His private secretary spoke in hushed tones about a crisis that required immediate royal presence. A devastating fire had swept through a children's hospital in Manchester, and while no lives had been lost, Dozens of young patients and their families were facing an uncertain future. The Queen had requested that make an emergency visit to offer comfort and support, and the symbolic weight of her presence would need to be carefully considered. As prepared for the hastily arranged journey, she found herself standing before her jewelry case in the early morning light, considering which tiara would be most appropriate for such a solemn occasion. The usual considerations of formality and tradition seemed inadequate when faced with genuine human suffering. She needed something that would convey compassion rather than grandeur, hope rather than hierarchy. Her hand moved instinctively toward the rose tiara, the delicate piece that had belonged to the Queen Mother's family. But as her fingers touched the case, she hesitated. Something about the moment called for a different kind of symbolism, a deeper connection to the transformative power of resilience in the face of devastation. It was then that her gaze fell upon a tiara she had never worn publicly, the Phoenix Crown, a remarkable piece created in the 1940s during the darkest days of World War II. The tiara had been commissioned by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, using diamonds recovered from jewelry damaged during the Blitz bombing of Palace. The design incorporated phoenix motifs rising from stylized flames, each bird crafted from diamonds that had literally been forged in fire. Had only learned of the Phoenix Crown's existence a few months earlier, during her ongoing research into the hidden stories of the royal collection. The tiara had been created in secret, intended as a symbol of Britain's determination to rise from the ashes of war. But the Queen Mother had worn it only once, to a private ceremony honoring the civilian heroes of the London Blitz, before deciding that its symbolism was too powerful for casual royal appearances. For decades, the Phoenix Crown had remained in its case, waiting for a moment worthy of its profound meaning. As held it now, feeling the weight of history and hope in its diamond framework, she knew that moment had finally arrived. The journey to Manchester gave time to research the tiara's remarkable creation story. During the Blitz, when German bombs had shattered windows and damaged several pieces in the royal jewelry collection, the Queen Mother had been devastated not by the material loss, but by the symbolic meaning of the destruction. These weren't just pretty ornaments. They were repositories of national memory, connections to generations of royal service and sacrifice. Rather than simply mourning the damaged pieces, the Queen Mother had commissioned the court jeweler to create something entirely new from the recovered diamonds. "Beauty can emerge from devastation," she had written in her private diary. "If our people can rebuild their lives from the rubble of their homes, surely we can create something meaningful from the fragments of our treasures." The jeweler had worked for months on the design, incorporating not just the recovered royal diamonds, but also smaller stones donated by ordinary British families whose own heirloom jewelry had been damaged in air raids. Each phoenix in the tiara's design represented a different aspect of the British spirit: courage, compassion, determination, and hope. The flames from which they rose were crafted from diamonds that had quite literally been touched by fire. When the tiara was completed, the Queen Mother had worn it to a secret ceremony in the underground shelter beneath Palace, where she met with representatives of London's bombing victims' rescue workers, volunteer nurses, ordinary citizens who had shown extraordinary courage during the worst nights of the war. The Phoenix Crown had blessed each of them, acknowledging their role in the nation's resurrection from its darkest hour. Now, as Carr approached the hospital in Manchester, she felt the weight of that legacy resting on her head. The Phoenix Crown seemed to pulse with accumulated energy, all those decades of stored symbolism finally finding their proper outlet. She understood that she wasn't just visiting sick children and their families. She was carrying forward a tradition of royal presence during times of crisis, offering not just comfort, but the promise that even the worst devastation could become the foundation for something beautiful and new. The scene at the hospital was heartbreaking and inspiring in equal measure. Children who had lost everything except their fighting spirit were already making plans for rebuilding their ward. Nurses who had worked through the night to evacuate patients were still on duty, refusing to leave until every child was settled in temporary accommodations. Parents were comforting other parents, creating an instant community of mutual support among strangers bound together by shared crisis. Moved through the crowd with careful grace, the Phoenix Crown catching the fluorescent lights of the temporary medical facility and throwing tiny rainbows across the walls. But what struck her most powerfully was how the tiara seemed to help her find exactly the right words for each person she met. To a young boy who had lost his collection of toy cars in the fire, she said, "Sometimes when we lose the things we love, It makes room for even better things to come into our lives. The phoenix crown seemed to lend authority to her words, transforming a simple platitude into a promise backed by centuries of royal faith in the resilience of the human spirit. To a mother who was struggling to hold back tears as she explained how her daughter's medical equipment had been destroyed, offered not just sympathy but a concrete commitment to ensuring that every child's needs would be met. "We will rebuild," she said, and the phoenix diamonds seemed to catch fire with determination. "And when we do, it will be stronger and better than what was lost." But it was during a quiet moment with an elderly volunteer coordinator that experienced the most profound connection to the phoenix crown's deeper meaning. The woman, who had been organizing relief efforts since the fire started, looked exhausted but refused to rest. "I lived through the Blitz as a child," the woman explained. "I remember how people came together then, how we found strength we didn't know we had. This fire reminds me that the same spirit still exists, we just need something to call it forth." Felt the phoenix crown grow warm against her temples as she realized the truth of those words. The tiara hadn't just been created to commemorate past resilience. It had been designed to invoke that same strength in future generations facing their own moments of crisis. As the day progressed, watch the phoenix crown work its subtle magic on everyone she encountered. Medical staff who had been running on adrenaline and determination found renewed energy for their work. Children who had been frightened and displaced began to show flickers of their natural optimism. Parents who had been overwhelmed by the magnitude of their losses started making practical plans for moving forward. The tiara seemed to serve as a catalyst for hope, its phoenix symbolism resonating on a level deeper than conscious thought. People began sharing stories of their own experiences with loss and recovery, creating an impromptu oral history of human resilience. Realized she was witnessing the same phenomenon that had occurred during the Blitz. Ordinary people discovering extraordinary strength when united by common purpose. Late in the afternoon, as prepared to return to London, a young girl approached her with a drawing she had made during the visit. The picture showed a hospital surrounded by phoenix birds rising from flames, their wings spread protectively over stick figures representing patients and medical staff. At the center of the image, a crowned figure stood with arms outstretched, her tiara clearly depicted as a crown of phoenix birds. "This is you helping us be brave," the little girl explained solemnly. "The firebirds in your crown are teaching our firebirds to fly." Felt tears threatening as she accepted the drawing, understanding that this child had somehow intuited the deeper purpose of the phoenix crown's design. The tiara wasn't just a symbol of recovery. It was a transmitter of courage, passing the strength of past generations to those facing present challenges. That evening, as sat in her study at Kensington Palace, she carefully placed the child's drawing on her desk and spent long minutes studying both the amateur artwork and the professional masterpiece of the phoenix crown, now resting in its case nearby. The two seemed to speak to each other across the divide between innocence and sophistication, both testifying to the same fundamental truth about the human capacity for renewal. She opened her private journal and began to write, trying to capture the day's profound lessons about the true purpose of royal jewelry. These weren't mere decorations or symbols of status, she realized. They were repositories of collective memory, tools for accessing and channeling the accumulated wisdom of generations of survivors and thrivers. The phoenix crown had taught her that wearing a tiara was ultimately an act of service, a commitment to carrying forward not just the beauty of the past, but its hard-won knowledge about how to transform suffering into strength. Each diamond in the royal collection represented countless moments of human triumph over adversity, and wearing them meant accepting responsibility for continuing that tradition of resilience. As she prepared for bed, took one last look at the phoenix crown, its diamonds now dark but still somehow radiating the warmth of the day's connections. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve as a bridge between past wisdom and present needs. But tonight, she felt profoundly grateful for the privilege of carrying forward such meaningful traditions, and for the reminder that even the darkest moments could become the foundation for something unexpectedly beautiful. The phoenix crown had found its moment at last, and in doing so, it had revealed to the deepest truth about royal service, that the most precious jewels in any crown were not the diamonds or pearls, but the unbreakable bonds of compassion that connected one human heart to another across time, circumstance, and the transformative power of shared hope. Years had passed since first began her journey into the hidden stories of the royal tiaras, and now she stood in the same mirrored chamber where her transformation had begun, but everything had changed. The woman reflected in the ancient glass was no longer the uncertain young bride who had trembled at the weight of the halo. She was a queen in all but name, a keeper of traditions who had learned to balance reverence for the past with innovation for the future. Tonight would mark a historic moment, would be wearing a tiara that had never before graced a royal head in public. The Millennium Crown had been discovered just months earlier in a sealed vault beneath George's Chapel at Windsor, accompanied by a letter that would revolutionize understanding of the royal jewelry collection's true purpose. The letter, written in Queen Victoria's distinctive handwriting, revealed that the Millennium Crown had been created in secret during the final years of her reign, intended as a legacy piece for the women who would carry the monarchy into its third millennium. Victoria had commissioned it using diamonds gathered from across the empire, but not as symbols of conquest or possession, rather, as representations of the interconnected nature of human experience across cultures and continents. Each stone carries the hopes of the people who gave it freely, Victoria had written in her letter. This crown is not meant to symbolize dominion over others, but responsibility to others. The woman who wears it must understand that true queenship means serving as a bridge between all peoples, all traditions, all dreams for a better world. The tiara itself was unlike anything in the royal collection. Its design incorporated elements from dozens of different cultural traditions, Celtic knots intertwined with Islamic geometric patterns, Indian lotus motifs flowing into African diamond arrangements, Chinese phoenixes rising alongside European roses. Every element had been crafted by master artisans from the respective cultures, their work united in a single magnificent piece that seemed to contain the wisdom of the world. As Lady-in-Waiting carefully positioned the Millennium Crown on her head, she felt an immediate difference from every other tiara she had ever worn. This piece didn't just carry the memory of individual women or specific historical moments. It pulsed with the collective aspiration of humanity itself, the shared dream of unity transcending division, of beauty emerging from diversity. Tonight's occasion was equally unprecedented. The first Global Unity Gala, an event herself had conceived to celebrate the launch of a new international initiative supporting education and healthcare in communities worldwide. Representatives from every continent would be present, including young people whose lives had been transformed by programs the royal family had helped to establish. But the true significance of the evening lay deeper than charitable fundraising or diplomatic relations. Had come to understand that her journey with the royal tiaras had been preparing her for this moment, when she would use the accumulated wisdom of centuries of royal service to address the challenges of a new era. As she made her way through the receiving line, greeting heads of state, Nobel laureates, and community leaders with equal warmth, felt the Millennium Crown facilitating connections that transcended language barriers and cultural differences. The tiara seemed to radiate an energy that helped people see past surface differences to recognize their shared humanity. A young woman from rural Bangladesh, whose village school had been supported by this educational initiative, approached during the reception with tears in her eyes. "Your Royal Highness," she said in carefully practiced English, "when I was a child, I never dreamed I would speak to a queen. Now I am studying medicine at university, and I want to return to my village as a doctor. You helped make my impossible dream possible." Felt the Millennium Crown pulse with warmth as she embraced the young woman, understanding that this moment was exactly what Queen Victoria had envisioned when she commissioned the piece. The tiara was designed to celebrate not the power of the person wearing it, but the potential of the people she served. Throughout the evening, similar encounters reinforced growing understanding of her role as a bridge between worlds. A technology entrepreneur from Kenya shared how royal patronage had helped his innovations reach communities that traditional aid organizations couldn't reach. An artist from Peru explained how cultural exchange programs had allowed her to share indigenous storytelling techniques with children in inner-city London, creating connections that enriched both communities. Each conversation added another layer to comprehension of the Millennium Crown's deeper purpose. This wasn't just a beautiful object or even a symbol of royal authority. It was a tool for recognizing and nurturing the infinite ways that human potential could flourish when given proper support and encouragement. But the evening's most profound moment came during S's keynote address, when she spoke about the lessons she had learned from her years of exploring the royal tiara collection. Standing before an audience that represented the full spectrum of human achievement and aspiration, she felt the Millennium Crown lending authority to words that came from the deepest part of her heart. I have been privileged to wear crowns that carry the memories of extraordinary women who came before me, said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed auditorium. Each tiara taught me something essential about the nature of service, about the responsibility that comes with privilege, about the transformative power of using whatever advantages we possess to lift up others. The Millennium Crown seemed to amplify not just her voice, but her message, helping it reach beyond the immediate audience to touch hearts around the world. Could feel the presence of all the women whose stories she had uncovered with her Lotus philosophy, Charlotte Spencer with her educational mission, the Queen Mother with her unwavering faith in human resilience, and countless others whose contributions had shaped the monarchy's evolution. Tonight, continued, I wear a crown that represents not just British heritage but human heritage. It reminds us that our differences are not barriers to overcome but gifts to share. Our diversity is not a challenge to manage, but our greatest strength when properly united toward common purpose. As she spoke, noticed something remarkable happening in the audience. People were spontaneously reaching out to take hands with those seated nearby, creating chains of connection that crossed every conceivable boundary of race, religion, nationality, and background. The Millennium Crown's energy seemed to be radiating outward, inspiring a tangible experience of the unity it symbolized. The gala raised unprecedented funds for global education and healthcare initiatives, but its true success lay in the relationships forged and the commitments made by people who had previously been strangers to each other. Watched as tech executives partnered with traditional healers, as artists collaborated with scientists, as young activists found mentorship with experienced diplomats. In the days that followed, messages poured in from around the world describing how the evening had inspired new collaborations and renewed dedication to service. The Millennium Crown had proven that Queen Victoria's vision was not naive idealism, but practical wisdom about the kind of leadership the world needed as it entered a new era of global interconnection. Began wearing the Millennium Crown to events focused on international cooperation and cultural exchange, each occasion reinforcing her understanding of its unique power to dissolve barriers and create unexpected connections. The tiara seemed to help her see beyond the immediate moment to envision the long-term impact of present actions on future generations. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sone's sense of identity and purpose. She no longer felt like someone wearing borrowed authority or performing inherited roles. The journey through the stories of the royal tiaras had revealed to her that she was part of an ongoing narrative of women who had discovered their own authentic power through service to others. The tiaras had been her teachers, but now she understood that she was becoming a teacher herself, showing a new generation how ancient symbols of hierarchy could be transformed into tools of empowerment and connection. Young people around the world were watching her example, learning that true nobility came not from title or birth, but from the courage to use whatever platform life provided to make the world more just, more beautiful, more hopeful. As prepared for sleep after another successful international event, carefully removing the Millennium Crown and placing it in its specially designed case, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as a young woman overwhelmed by the weight of tradition, uncertain whether she could live up to the expectations of royal service. Now she understood that those expectations had been transformed by her own authentic engagement with them. The tiaras had not demanded that she become someone else. They had helped her discover who she truly was beneath the surface roles and responsibilities. They had shown her that the most powerful crown of all was not made of diamonds and gold, but of genuine compassion, unwavering integrity, and the courage to keep serving even when the path forward was unclear. The Millennium Crown caught the moonlight streaming through her window one final time before its case closed, and felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, new moments when the weight of the crown would test her resolve. But she was ready for whatever lay ahead, confident in the knowledge that she carried forward not just the beauty of the past, but its hard-won wisdom about the transformative power of love in action. The tiaras had whispered their secrets, and had learned to speak their language of service, sacrifice, and hope. Now it was her turn to ensure that these precious stories continued into the future, inspiring new generations of women to discover their own crowns of purpose and their own power to transform the world through the simple revolutionary act of caring deeply about the welfare of others.